The wind was a blade. It did not howl. It sheared. It stripped the warmth from the air, the sound from the sky, and the courage from a man's heart. Elias Thorne felt it through 3 layers of wool and oiled canvas. It found the seams and the gaps, a physical thing that sought his bones. Ahead, a wall of white blotted out the world. There was no up, no down, only the horizontal fury of the blizzard. His horse, Copper, lowered his head, a bronze shield against the ice-laced gale. Each step was a plunge, a guess into the accumulating drifts. The world they had known an hour ago, a world of sharp peaks and dark pines, was gone. It had been erased. Now there was only the storm, and the one place the storm could not go. Elias leaned low over Copper's neck, his gloved hand resting on the thick mane. He spoke, his words ripped away by the wind, but felt by the animal. "Almost there, boy. Almost home." It was a lie and a truth. They were not going to the small, square cabin he owned on the edge of town. That cabin was a tinderbox, a trap. They were going to the folly. Thorne's folly. He saw it then, a darker slash in the universal white. The entrance to the gorge. The wind grew stronger here, funneled between the rock walls, a final test. Copper fought against it, muscles straining. Elias urged him on, his own breath frosting his beard into a solid mask of ice. They pushed through the entrance, and suddenly the roaring of the wind changed. It was no longer all around them. It was above them. They were in the throat of the gorge, and the storm was passing over its lips. Here the snow fell, but it did not drive. It was a curtain, not a battering ram. Elias could see the shape he had carved from the earth and rock, a low, curved mound pressed against the north wall of the canyon, almost invisible. A door, thick and planked, was set deep into its face. He slid from the saddle, his legs stiff with cold. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers clumsy stumps. The heavy door swung inward, revealing not darkness, but a soft, steady glow. He led Copper inside, into the scent of dry hay, warm stone, and burning oak. He pushed the door shut, and the world went quiet. The blade of the wind was gone. The fury was locked outside. Inside the arch, the earth held. 6 months earlier, Elias had unrolled the schematics on Sheriff Brody's desk. The paper was weighted down with 4 smooth river stones. The drawings were done in charcoal and ink, precise and clear. They showed a cross-section of a structure built not on the land, but into it. Sheriff Brody leaned over the desk, his spectacles perched on his nose. He was a man who understood square corners, plumb lines, and pitched roofs. He did not understand curves dug from a hillside. "What in God's name is this, Thorne?" "It's a shelter," Elias said. His voice was quiet, accustomed to the open spaces, not small offices. "A winter redoubt." "It looks like a badger's set," Brody snorted. He tapped a finger on the drawing of the main arch. "You mean to live in a hole in the ground?" "Not a hole," Elias corrected gently. "An arch. A sod arch construction built into the north face of Jasper Gorge. It uses the earth for insulation and the rock for a foundation. The wind will go over it, not through it." The sheriff took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. He had known Elias for 5 years, since the man had mustered out of the cavalry scouts and bought his small parcel of land. Thorne was quiet, competent, and kept to himself. But this was something else. This was madness. "Elias, People here in Prosperity Gulch build log cabins. Good, solid timber. We've been doing it for 50 years. It works. Why would you want to bury yourself alive? Because the winters are changing, Elias said. He did not raise his voice.
He stated it as a fact, like the sun rising or the river freezing. I was with the survey teams in the high country. The old signs are different. The pine cones are tighter. The squirrels' caches are deeper. The last 3 winters have been mild, but the snowpack on the peaks is heavier than it's been in decades. The mountain is storing it up. When it lets go, it will be a winter men write about for 100 years. Brody laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, but it was dismissive. You sound like some old mountain man spooking the children. Thorn, this is progress. We have a railroad spur coming next year. We don't listen to pine cones anymore. The railroad won't stop the snow, Elias said. He began rolling up his plans. He had not come for permission, only for courtesy. The gorge was on his land. It's your business, Brody said, shaking his head. But if you start digging up that gorge, people are going to talk.
They'll think you've got cabin fever before the first frost. The sheriff was right. The talk started the day Elias guided his mule, laden with shovels and picks, into Jasper Gorge. It began as curiosity. Men would ride out, watch him from the rim of the canyon as he cleared the rock face, and go back to town with stories. He's digging all right, one would say at the general store. Like a man possessed. Thinks he's going to find gold in that granite. When the shape of the structure began to emerge, the curiosity turned to mockery. The name was coined by a surveyor who came to update the county maps. He stood with Sheriff Brody, looking down at the strange, curved foundation Elias was laying. Well, I'll be, the surveyor said, scratching his chin. Looks like Thorn is building himself a folly. The name stuck. Thorn's Folly. It became the town joke. Children would whisper it.
Men would say it with a wink over a beer.
Heard Thorn is ordering a periscope from the mail order catalogue, they'd jest, so he can see when spring arrives. Elias heard the whispers. He saw the smiles that vanished when he turned his head. It did not matter. The town talked. He worked. The work was methodical, born of a deep and patient logic. First came the site. He chose the north wall of the gorge deliberately. It would bear the brunt of the prevailing winter wind, which would scour snow away from his entrance, rather than burying it. The low angle of the winter sun would still strike the south-facing entrance for a few hours each day, melting any ice that formed. He spent a month with a pick and a star drill, shaping the granite wall that would become the back of his home. He did not blast. The shock could destabilize the rock. It was slow, punishing labor. He chipped and chiseled, creating a flat, vertical surface, 40 feet wide and 10 feet high.
Then he excavated the floor, digging down to the bedrock, leveling it with a precision that would have impressed the surveyor who had mocked him. This was his foundation. Unmovable. Eternal. Next came the arches. This was the heart of the design, the secret to its strength. He did not have the means to steam bend great timbers. Instead, he rode copper deep into the old-growth forest, searching for trees that had been forced to grow in a natural curve. Trees reaching for sunlight around a rockfall, or bent by decades of heavy snow. He felled 10 of them, great pines, whose wood was dense and seasoned on the stump. He shaped them with a broadaxe and an adze, not into smooth, uniform beams, but into ribs that followed the natural strength of the wood's grain. Each arch was made of 2 opposing curves, meeting at a peak. He did not nail them. He cut mortise and tenon joints, locking them together at the apex with hardwood pegs he carved from oak. These were the bones of the shelter. He raised the 5 great arches himself, using a simple block and tackle anchored to a pine on the gorge rim, with copper providing the pulling power. They stood like the rib cage of some great beast, their bases set into notches he had cut in the bedrock floor. The town saw the ribs go up, and the jokes changed. Now it was not a badger's set, but a wooden whale beached in a canyon. Between the arches, he laid the walls. These were not logs. He used the stone he had excavated, splitting it into manageable blocks. He built 2 parallel walls 2 feet apart and filled the gap between them with a mixture of dry moss and soil. It was an old technique, a breathing insulation that would not trap moisture and rot. The roof was the final, crucial element. Over the arched ribs, he laid a deck of thick, rough-sawn planks. On top of this, he stretched and overlapped cowhides he had traded for, treating them with a mixture of tallow and pine tar until they were waterproof. This was his membrane against the wet. Above the hides came a 6-inch layer of dense clay he had dug from a riverbed, pounded smooth and left to dry. And finally, on top of the clay, he laid the sod. He cut it from the valley floor in thick, square bricks, rich with the tangled roots of a century of prairie grass. He laid them in an overlapping pattern, like immense green shingles. The roots would continue to grow, knitting the entire roof into a single, living shield. The weight of the sod, clay, and stone was immense. It pressed down on the arches, settling them, locking them into the bedrock. A conventional square-framed structure would have collapsed. But the arch, the most elegant and strongest of forms, took the weight and distributed it perfectly outward and downward into the unyielding earth. The folly was not sitting on the land. It was part of it. Inside, he divided the space. 2/3 was for him, a stone hearth and chimney built against the back wall, a bed frame, a table. The final third, separated by a sturdy partition, was a stable for Copper. It was warmer and safer than any barn in the county. A small, clever ventilation system, a series of baffled, stone-lined shafts, allowed fresh air to circulate without creating a draft. He built a masonry heater, not a simple fireplace. It was a mass of stone and firebrick with a winding, serpentine flue. A single hot fire for 2 hours in the morning and 2 in the evening would heat the entire stone mass, which would then radiate a steady, even warmth for the rest of the day and night. It was efficient. It conserved wood. He had a stack of seasoned oak and pine that would last him 2 years. He stockpiled supplies: sacks of flour, beans and oats, crates of salted pork and dried apples, kerosene for his lamps, ammunition for his rifle. He was not preparing for a long winter. He was preparing for a siege. By the time the first snows fell in the high country, the folly was complete. From the gorge rim, it was nearly invisible, just a gentle green mound against the grey rock. The grass on the sod roof had taken root, softening its edges. A thin plume of smoke from its chimney was the only sign of life. His trips to town became less frequent. The air of mockery had solidified into a kind of pitying disregard. He was no longer a joke, just the town eccentric. Thorn the mole. He would buy his few necessities, nod silently at the stairs, and ride back to his gorge. He preferred the silence. The silence was honest. In late November, the signs began to accumulate. A flock of geese, flying south, turned back north in confusion, their calls frantic. The deer herds moved from the foothills into the protected river valleys, weeks ahead of schedule. Elias, checking his trap lines, saw a cougar hunting in broad daylight, its hunger overriding its caution. The natural world was holding its breath. Copper felt it too. The horse grew restless in his pasture, staying close to the gorge, his ears twitching at sounds Elias could not hear. He would stare at the northern horizon for long minutes, his nostrils flared. Elias started keeping him in the shelter's stable at night. The sky took on a strange, pearlescent haze. The sun was a pale wafer, casting no warmth. The air grew still and heavy, the temperature dropping steadily. It was a cold that felt different. It felt ancient. It had weight. On the first day of December, Elias rode into Prosperity Gulch for a final sack of salt and 2 boxes of cartridges. The town was festive, preparing for Christmas. A wreath hung on the door of the general store. Men stood about, talking of the railroad and the price of beef. They complained about the cold snap. "Be a hard frost tonight," one said to Elias as he tied Copper to the hitching post. Elias looked north. The horizon was no longer hazy. It was a deep, bruised purple, a solid line that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, rising. "It's more than a frost," he said. The man laughed. "Don't tell me, Thorn. The pine cones are screaming, are they?" Elias did not answer. He bought his supplies, loaded his saddlebags, and mounted Copper. Sheriff Brody watched him from the boardwalk in front of his office. He shook his head slowly, a look of genuine concern on his face. He saw a man preparing for a war that only he could see. A man lost in a folly of his own making. As Elias rode out of town, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were small and dry, like grains of salt. They spiraled down in the unnervingly still air. By the time he reached the gorge, the sky was a uniform leaden grey, and the flakes were growing larger, thicker. The world was losing its edges. He settled Copper in the stable, checked the fire in the masonry heater, and barred the door. The waiting was over. For the first day, the storm was merely a heavy snow. It fell with a quiet insistence, burying the landscape in a soft, white blanket. Inside the shelter, Elias was comfortable. The masonry heater radiated a gentle warmth that kept the air at a constant 60 degrees. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft munching of Copper eating his hay and the crackle of the fire. On the second day, the wind came. It started as a low moan, a distant thing. Within hours, it was a physical assault. Elias listened to it from inside his sanctuary. He could hear it shrieking over the top of the gorge, a sound of pure, mindless power. But it did not touch the shelter. The wind flowed over the curved roof as if it were a natural hill. The immense weight of the earth held the structure in a solid embrace. There were no rattles, no drafts, no creaks of straining wood. The arch held. The earth held. He thought of the town. He pictured the houses, their pitched roofs catching the wind like sails. He imagined the snow piling up against their northern walls, the drafts finding their way through the chinking of the log cabins. He imagined the fires burning desperately in their hearths, consuming wood at a ferocious rate, most of the heat roaring straight up the chimney and into the storm. On the third day, the temperature plummeted. Elias had a thermometer outside the door in a sheltered alcove. He opened the door a crack and shone his lantern on it. The mercury was huddled at the bottom of the glass, 30 below zero. And with the wind, the chill factor would be unimaginable. He closed the door quickly. The cold that had tried to push its way in was palpable. Later that day, he heard a new sound. It was not the wind. It was a faint, desperate banging on the thick outer door. He was stunned. Nothing should be alive out in that. He drew his pistol, a precaution born of long habit, and unbarred the door. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it open. A figure, a shapeless mound of snow and ice, stumbled in and collapsed onto the floor, followed by two smaller figures. They were human, barely. Elias dragged them in and forced the door shut against the storm. He pulled back the hoods. It was a man, his wife, and their young son. The Miller family, who had a small homestead 5 miles upriver. "Thorn?" the man, Jacob Miller, rasped through a frozen beard. We saw your smoke, yesterday, before the worst of it."
"The roof,"
his wife sobbed, her body racked with shivers.
"The weight of the snow. It just came down."
Elias said nothing. He stripped them of their frozen outer clothes, wrapped them in thick wool blankets, and sat them before the radiant heat of the masonry stove. He ladled hot broth into mugs and forced them to drink it slowly. The boy, no older than 7, stared with wide, terrified eyes at the calm, warm space, at the great horse standing peacefully in his stall. It was a place of impossible safety in a world that had come apart. "Our cabin is gone," Jacob said, his voice stronger now. "We burned the last of the furniture for warmth. We were going to die in there." He looked around the shelter, at the curved ceiling, the solid stone walls. "They call this Thorn's Folly." He shook his head, a look of awe on his face. "They are the fools, all of them." For 2 more days, the storm raged. The 5 of them lived in the shelter. Elias's stores were more than enough. The space was not cramped. The air remained fresh. The masonry heater required only a small amount of wood to keep the entire space warm. Outside, the world was being scoured clean. Inside, there was life. On the morning of the 5th day, they woke to silence. A profound, ringing silence. The wind was gone. Elias opened the door. The sight was breathtaking. The gorge was filled with snow, level with its rim. His shelter was a cave in a vast white mountain. A brilliant, cold sun shone from a sky of the deepest blue. The storm was over. He left the Millers with ample food and a low fire. He dug out a path for copper, and the 2 of them climbed the deep snowdrift to the rim of the gorge. The landscape was unrecognizable. It was a new world, sculpted by wind and snow. The forest was a collection of white mounds. The river was a frozen, buried line. He rode toward Prosperity Gulch. It was a hard, slow journey. The snow was 15 feet deep in the open, with drifts that were twice that. He saw the tops of barns, the peaks of roofs. Some were simply gone, marked only by a splintered timber sticking out of the snow like a grave marker. When he reached the town, the devastation was shocking. Roofs had collapsed under the weight, windows were shattered. The general store had been torn open by the wind, its contents scattered and buried. A handful of survivors were digging themselves out, their faces gaunt and frostbitten. He saw Sheriff Brody organizing a group of men, their movements slow and exhausted. The sheriff looked up as Elias and Copper approached, their forms dark against the blinding snow. He stared, as if seeing a ghost. "Thorn," he said, his voice hoarse. We thought you were dead. No one could survive that in the gorge." "The gorge was the safest place to be," Elias said simply. "My shelter held." One of the other men, his face smudged with soot, spoke up. "We lost 7 people, Thorn. The Hendersons, their chimney blocked with ice, the house filled with smoke. The old widow froze in her bed. The weight. The roofs just couldn't take the weight." Brody walked over to Elias. He put a hand on Copper's warm flank, then looked up at the man he had called a fool.
There was no mockery in his eyes now, only a deep, weary respect. "You tried to tell me," the sheriff said. His voice was low, for Elias alone. "You saw it coming."
We were all so busy being clever, we forgot to be wise. He took a deep breath of the brutally cold air. "I was wrong, Elias. We were all wrong."
Elias simply nodded. There was no triumph in his gaze, only sorrow for the lost. Vindication was a bitter meal. "The Millers are at my shelter," he said. "They're safe. Their homestead is gone." The news that people had survived out in the wild was a spark of hope. The men looked at Elias with new eyes. He was no longer Thorn the mole, the eccentric living in a hole. He was the man who had faced the storm and won. In the days that followed, Elias became the center of the town's survival. He taught them how to build snow caves for emergency shelter. He showed them which timbers in their ruined houses were still sound. His knowledge of the wilderness, once a source of amusement, was now their most valuable resource. A rescue party, led by Elias, brought the Millers back to town. Their story spread like wildfire.
They spoke of the calm, the steady warmth, the unshakable strength of Thorn's folly. Men who had joked about it now asked Elias to draw the plans for them again, their voices humbled and eager. They no longer saw a hole in the ground. They saw a miracle of engineering. They saw wisdom. Years passed. Prosperity Gulch was rebuilt, but it was different. The new houses were built with a deeper respect for the power of the land. Roofs were built with steeper pitches, foundations were set deeper. And on the outskirts of town, two families built their own homes, using Elias's sod arch design, their green roofs a testament to a lesson learned in the hardest way. Thorn's Folly was never called that again. It became known simply as the Arch. It stood as a permanent feature of the landscape, a landmark of survival. In subsequent hard winters, it served as a community shelter, its thick door always ready to open for travelers caught in a storm. Elias Thorn never said, "I told you so." He never had to. He lived out his days in his quiet gorge, a respected elder of the community he had saved. He continued to read the signs in the land, not as a prophet of doom, but as a student of a language older and more truthful than any spoken by men. The legacy he left was not one of fear, but of foresight. He had proven that madness and wisdom can sometimes look the same from a distance. True preparation was not about hiding from the world in fear, but about understanding it so deeply that you knew how to yield to its power, how to find shelter not just on the earth, but within it. The arch in the gorge stood as silent proof, a curve of profound strength, a place where the earth itself offered sanctuary. And beside it, until his last day, a fine horse named Copper grazed peacefully in the sun, a living symbol of a trust that had been rightly placed.